We live, of course, in the shadow of the Second World War and appeasement. It's such a dirty word. And, in the West, too, politicians are so worried about appeasement. I don't know why. I mean, reaching conciliatory agreement seems to me to be a fairly sensible thing.
Hello. Joining today is Richard Overy, a hugely distinguished historian, predominantly of the Second World War, and a man described by A.J.P. Taylor as highly effective in the ruthless dispelling of myths. He's the author of countless best-selling and award-winning books, and he's now written Why War? So this is something I haven't really discussed so far. I mean, obviously there's been quite a bit of war on the pod, particularly with the D-Day anniversary and our latest 100 Years War series. Is aspects of history too war-obsessed? Should women be in charge? What are the motivations? And does war actually work? All these questions are asked, and more. Plenty more great history to come, including the ancient Greeks, Roman gladiators, killing Hitler, Valkyrie, the Tom Cruise vehicle for our film club, espionage, and plenty more. So please do subscribe or follow. If you can share the pod, it really does help it to grow and get more and more guests. But until then, I'll hand you over to myself and Richard Overy discussing why do we go to war. Richard Overy, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to speak to you. And we're talking because of your new book, Why War? And I suppose, having written so many books on conflict, was this a sort of an inevitable decision to write a book as to why, the reasons for all these conflicts that you've written about in the past?
Well, it did seem as a necessary end point in a way. And having spent most of my life working on the Second World War, the biggest and deadliest war in human history, one is naturally curious about why it is that the human species is so belligerent. And you look back and you find belligerence goes way, way back into the archaic past. And yeah, I was curious really to see what people make of it. How do people explain it? Why are we such a belligerent species?
It is really unique to us, isn't it?
It is. There's been a lot of effort to try and compare us with gorillas and chimpanzees and so on, but I think the evidence is pretty thin. We've got to look at human evolution. It's completely different from the evolution of any other animal species. And by the time we had developed the capacity to use technology, symbolic thought, and so on, the gulf was huge.
It's interesting talking of the evolutionary aspect of this, really, because humanity's evolved technologically comparing to the wheel and sticks and stones. And now, we have the internet and communications, and we're looking at artificial intelligence in the future. But we haven't really evolved. If anything, our wars have become more deadly. So I suppose that's evolutionary in that regard. However, it's also sort of, conversely, it seems like we've gone backwards because we're more deadly. We're killing. We're more efficient at killing people.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, even way back 30 years ago, people were trying to find more efficient ways of killing their enemies. And yes, I mean, we haven't evolved in the sense that we've lost war as one of the options that human societies will engage in. When they're pressed to do so, when they feel it's necessary, or when the leader forces them to do so. But that's something which we can see throughout recorded history. They're more deadly, they're better organized, the technology is now remarkable, and at the end point, we've got, of course, thermonuclear weapons. But we haven't lost the habit of waging war when we feel it's necessary.
Do you think, because I know you've separated the book into chapters, sort of, which I suppose they are sort of motivations for war, really?
Well, I divided the book into two sections. The first part really looks at the way different disciplines try to explain war, scientific disciplines, whether it's biology or psychology or ecology and so on. And the second half, I focus much more on the motivational nexus, how you can trace that way back in time as well. I've divided it up into resources, belief, power, and security, because each of those, invites a rather different kind of discussion. They're not mutually exclusive, But I've separated them out because, in a way, that's what the scholarship does. It separates, them out, the biological explanations from, cultural anthropological explanations. And I wanted to explore what these explanations were to see how plausible they were.
Have you drawn a conclusion that there's always one motivation that's consistent throughout all conflict?
Well, some of these major motivations perhaps are more common. Resources, for example, I mean, you can trace that back. You can imagine very easily how ancient man fought over hunting grounds, over access to raw material resources and so on. Just as you can see in the 20th century that, Germany and Japan went to war desperately to get hold of oil. And that's a theme, I think, which runs through a great deal of our knowledge of war, both ancient and modern. But belief also plays a very important part. Whether it's religious belief or whether it's political ideology and so on, driving people to make war to protect those beliefs or to extend those beliefs. Power and security are the two things I think that a great many political and social scientists latch onto as the most important. And I suppose in some ways security is one of the most important, because if you go right back in time, clearly one of the things that small tribal communities were always worried about was, what's the community next door going to do? Can we trust them? Are we secure? Where do we need to go to become more secure? And as we've reached a world of settled states and fixed frontiers, that's something which becomes even more troubling. Is anybody going to threaten our frontier? Is there something beyond the frontier we need, which we can fight for? And of all the different motivations, that's the one I think that political scientists in particular have focused on a great deal. That most wars since the beginning of the 19th century have been between neighbours, and a very high portion have been arguments about frontier territory.
Yes, the Second World War is obviously a conflict that inside out. I mean, Hitler viewed his various invasions, I guess, as sort of protecting Germany by expanding.
Yeah, well, this is a classic example, if you like, of kind of ecological thinking. For Hitler, there wasn't enough land and resources for the Germans, and if resources were controlled by other people, by the empires, by United States, and so on, well, you had to find a way of getting resources for the German people. And that meant more territory too, where you could grow more food. It was a very simplistic argument on Hitler's part, but Lebensraum, that's what it amounted to. You needed to go out and take land. Once you've got it, you could then become a great power. You might become more secure. You could, use some of your beliefs, particularly anti-Semitism, of course, to cleanse this area of living space. But there's no doubt that Hitler rationalized war in terms which are recognizable if we look at the range of motives we've been talking about.
But if we look at Europe today, Germany is a major power, is probably the preeminent power on the continent, and it hasn't gone to war. So it's averse to war. I mean, it's a standing army is not significant in any way, and so war really. I mean, I know the question is why war, and then there's the song "War, What Is It Good For?" I mean, Germany has demonstrated that you can become a major power on the continent without war.
Indeed, yeah. Well, I think the Second World War taught everybody a lesson,
Yes.
and the Germans more than anybody else. I think in Europe we've lived in something of a bubble really for the last 80 years. War has gone on all around us, often really major wars, whether it's Vietnam or Iran, Iraq. Wars have gone on, so war hasn't stopped. But Europe has stopped, bleeding itself to death, which it had done for centuries. But Europe has to be aware of what's going on in the wider world. It's not something that you can take for granted. So although we don't make war against each other, there's no doubt that we have a good deal of concern about our external security, not least at the moment, all these arguments about, will Russia invade? I don't think Russia will invade, but it's prompted Europe once again to think about the possibility, that war, may be a 21st century reality.
Well, indeed, I guess that leads on to the inevitable quote, if you want peace, prepare for war.
Yes. Yeah.
And and we're finding that out. I mean, there's a lot of pressure. Well, there's a lot of discussion now about this country in Britain. We should be increasing spending, defense spending. But there is a truth to that. If you want peace,
Yeah.
prepare for war, isn't there?
Well, I suppose there is, yeah. I mean, I worry a little bit that, all the major states now are busy beefing up their military, and they're all flexing their muscles in front of each other. Where the sensible thing really is to do is to calm down and say, look, everybody, okay, we have this crisis in Ukraine. We have a growing division between the West and the authoritarian Eurasia and so on. But the best thing is really to calm down and to think about ways of resolving many of these issues. Um, but if you read through everything I've written in the book, you realize that actually, military and political leaders are often just incapable of doing that. The first thing they think of is there going to be war? Are we threatened? What should we say to power X if it's going to get in our way? And we can see that whether it's problems in the Far East, problems in the Middle East, or whether it's problems in Eastern Europe. I wish it were different, but all the evidence suggests that war is still one of those options that we keep always on a back burner.
Well, yes, I was speaking to Frank Gardner, the BBC security correspondent, recently, and he's written a novel where China attempts to invade Taiwan. And that, having spoken to him, rather depressingly, it seemed almost inevitable that China will attempt to invade Taiwan at some point. And I know in the book, you mention Lawrence Friedman, who states that, great powers are unlikely to fight it and will instead
Mm.
use proxies. So I suppose Taiwan in this case would be the proxy. But do you agree with Lawrence Friedman that there won't be conflicts between great powers? Because America has committed to defend Taiwan.
Mm. Well, I wish I could agree, but I don't think it's, we can't predict the future. We don't know what will be happening by, a century's time. But any more than anybody could predict the terrible wars of the 20th century in 1900. So it's not an impossibility. The Taiwan issue, of course, I mean, it's strange, really. Why does China want to take over Taiwan? And I think, in Beijing, they probably say the same. We don't want to take over Taiwan necessarily. But that is a much more dangerous conflict if that happens than the conflict in Ukraine, because America is committed to protecting that part of East Asia. Japan will become involved. And what you desperately hope is that people have read enough history to know that the dangerous thing is to escalate. Don't push thresholds. But again, we can't be confident that that won't happen in the 21st century as well.
Well, yes. Okay, so you mentioned people should be reading history. Often, knowledge of history itself is a driver for war, isn't it? I mean, we look at the
Yeah.
Balkans, what
Yes.
Europe's. I mean, that
Yes.
they are so aware of their history, and that's
Yes.
why they were killing each other.
Well, Putin uses history all the time. He uses it selectively. He has a particular view of the historic, recent history and the Soviet Union. So you wish he'd read different history books. I mean, I think when I say, I wish they'd read more history, I think that, for example, if you read the background to the outbreak of the First World War, which was the most terrible and unexpected of all wars, and you see all the mistakes people make. You see all the brinkmanship. You see pushing thresholds that didn't have to be pushed, and so on, until suddenly they all found themselves at war. There are lessons to be learned from this. You've got to have politicians who are willing to pull back. We live, of course, in the shadow of the Second World War and appeasement. It's such a dirty word. And, in the West, too, politicians are so worried about appeasement. I don't know why. I mean, reaching conciliatory agreement seems to me to be a fairly sensible thing. Giving in to, blackmail and bullying, of course, isn't. But, there's a wide spectrum there. You can approach, the issue of international affairs with a view to, conciliation and agreement, not confrontation.
I studied ancient history, and Thucydides is clearly a great resource for this kind of subject.
Mm.
And you mentioned Thucydides a number of times in the book. I suppose his doctrine was almost, that the strong will do what they must.
Yes.
That's a truism to me that's always been true and always will be true.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it certainly has been true. I mean, there are many cases where the not so strong take risks which they shouldn't take. I mean, the obvious one is Japan taking on the United States in 1941, what a crazy thing to do. But there are, I suppose in the end that there's a rough truth there that that strong tribes, states, and so on will think to themselves, well, I can get a bit more because I'm stronger than neighbor X. I think I'm stronger than neighbor X. And that's where power becomes such an important aspect of our explanation for why wars occur. But it's always power for something. They want to take territory, they want tribute, they want to dominate an area territorially, build an empire, compete with others. Power is the instrument, but it's always going to be for something. But yes, throughout history, there have been powerful states and communities that have said to themselves, you know, I'm not satisfied with what I got. I want something else, and they use their power to get it.
Well, you also write about Alexander in the book, and so he's obviously probably Alexander and Napoleon are probably the two
Mm,
one thinks of, but
yeah.
Alexander almost fought for the sake of fighting. I mean,
Mm,
he didn't. He was accumulating
mm,
a vast empire, but
mm,
I always think that that wasn't really what motivated him. He just wanted to carry on fighting and conquering,
mm.
not for resources, not for. It was just he was addicted to war. Do you think that's true of Alexander?
Yeah, I mean, he's my one. I've got three examples: Alexander, Napoleon, and Hitler. And I talk about power, but Alexander is perhaps the clearest example of somebody who just pursues power for its own sake. And he can't stop. He's driven. Napoleon is driven. He can't stop. What's the point of invading Russia in 1812? There was no point, and it led to his defeat. And in the case of Alexander, he just wanted to go on and on and on. And the more power he got, I think the more he felt to himself, I'm divinely helped here. This is providence, and I've been called to establish this huge empire. But it was huge, unwieldy, and as you know, fell apart, of course, as soon as Alexander died. So Alexander, Napoleon, yes, you get these hubristic figures who really think that they can, take history and mold it themselves. And they have no other motive really but the desire to express that power.
Richard, I had a conversation with my wife the other day talking about. I mean, she said that if there were more female leaders, there would be less war. And we had a bit of a discussion, and in the end, she told me to shut up and stop annoying her because I mentioned a number of female leaders who, Catherine the Great, for example,
Yeah.
and Margaret Thatcher is an obvious one regarding the Falklands.
Mm,
And my wife said, well, they had to behave like men because they're in a men's world.
mm,
And I've read Margaret Macmillan, who I'm sure you're aware,
mm.
writes very, very convincingly that there wouldn't be less war if more women were in charge. I wonder where you stand on all this.
Well, it's a rather speculative question.
Yes, it is.
I mean, I think in general, if there were more women in charge, there would be less war. I think it follows automatically. I mean, war has been throughout the whole of recorded history a male activity. You can have a Catherine the Great. You can have a Queen Elizabeth I. You can have a Golda Meir or whatever. Um, but uh, they are doing what male advisors around them advise them to do, and they are waging war as men would wage it. But I think if there were more women in charge, there would just be less war. It's not it's a male activity. It's not a female activity. And I'm sure I'll get hit over the head for saying that, but it's not. That's what evolution has done. And I think we might wish, in fact, that there were more female leaders who could actually sit around and discuss issues properly rather than always reaching immediately, to flex your muscles and say, we got this, we got that.
Yeah.
Uh, but let's see. I mean, I think I'll be shot down by both sides probably.
Well, I suppose this is an area where we are finally seeing more female leaders in power, numerically. So potentially that's the sort of hope we can have coming out of that maybe means we'll see less war. Who knows?
Well, let's hope so. I mean, it's going to be a long time before we see a female president of the United States, I think.
Yes, yes, that's true. That's true. You mentioned cyber war towards the end of the book, and
Mm.
I'm very interested in cyber warfare. You also mentioned a particular operation, I think the Stuxnet. Hello, just a quick word on the Stuxnet operation, which some listeners might not be aware of. In the late 2000s, US government agencies developed a computer virus for use against the Iranian nuclear program. With the assistance of the Mossad in delivering the virus, the program was installed via USB stick into the uranium enrichment infrastructure in Isfahan, Iran. It was a major escalation in cyber warfare, and the cost benefits are still argued over today. Anyway, back to the show. At first glance, cyber warfare seems a sort of few casualties and it's sort of another proxy, I suppose. But
Mm,
the potential of disastrous consequences of cyber warfare, because of the internet is so, it's everywhere,
mm,
it could be catastrophic and as catastrophic
mm,
as nuclear conflict.
mm. Well, perhaps not quite as much as nuclear conflict, but potential, of course, is to be massively disorientating. If you destroy the commercial and military networks of your potential enemy, it's catastrophic. It's extremely difficult to restore, perhaps in time, and that's why, of course, all states, major states, are spending their time thinking about how to counteract cyber warfare or how to project cyber warfare onto a potential enemy. It will be part of future warfare, and its effects, as you say, could be extraordinarily debilitating, but not quite like thermonuclear war, where if it happens, it kills tens and tens of millions of people.
But you could have a cyber attack that launched a missile and then a response from an opponent.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, cyber warfare, yes, there's plenty of potential for mischief. And one hopes that again, is not going to happen, or that ways will be found to cope with it. I mean, the other thing I talk about in the book is warfare in space, which of course is really linked to cyber warfare, where again, the assumption early on in the 60s and 70s that space ought to be a neutral area, so that all states could explore and be interested in space. But it's become a much more dangerous area, and China has been experimenting with anti-satellite exercises of one kind or another, and so on. America is busy finding ways of protecting its satellite presence in space. This is another arena in the 21st century where we might see conflict, and its effects will be rather similar. I mean, to destroy communication, military and commercial, with potentially devastating consequences.
One worrying statistic is we've seen increasingly, particularly in the 20th century, as you know, is increasing numbers of civilian casualties. It almost seems we're very worried about deaths of military personnel, and as a consequence, the risk of civilian casualties is increased. And I think there's a sort of statistic somewhere floating around,
Mm,
sort of 20% casualties of civilians in the early part of the 20th century. I think World War One is a good example.
mm,
But now that's flipped, and it's now 20% military and 80%.
yeah,
I'm sort of
yeah.
estimating here, which I suppose means we've gone backward.
Yes, yeah. I mean, for a long time in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was an effort to establish a legal framework which would protect civilians, and that continued on into the 1970s, where the assumption was that the Second World War had been such an appalling war in terms of civilian casualties that there must be a way of restricting or limiting that. But it just hasn't happened. We've got the two major wars so far this century in Ukraine and Gaza, which are catastrophic for civilians. They violate every norm that has been established since 1945. So yes, there is no protection for civilians, and there ought to be. The military, ought to fight each other if they're going to fight each other. They're not going to. Civilians will always be in the way, and they will be in the way, of course, in any nuclear exchange, which is going to destroy civilian lives on a massive scale. So yes, have we gone back? We probably have gone backwards. Let's go back to Genghis Khan and putting the entire population of cities to the sword if they refuse to pay tribute. Are we back in the Roman Empire again, killing the male inhabitants and enslaving the rest? Yes, I wish it were otherwise, but the two current wars at the moment are absolutely horrific in that respect. They show no interest whatsoever in the idea of protecting civilians from damage.
No. And do you think we in the West, because there's been a civil war in the Congo in the early 2000s. I mean that the deaths there is a million. I mean 3 million.
Mm,
Sometimes people quote
mm,
4 million. And very few people in the West even know about it.
yeah.
Is this a real blind spot that the West has, do you think, in the way we look at conflict? If they're close to us or they look like us, we're more interested.
Mm. Oh, yeah, it's true. I mean, it's actually Ukraine, where, of course, so many people know about the Second World War in Ukraine and so on, what happened, and so we do focus a great deal more attention on that. The other civil war is the civil war in Sudan, or a variety of civil wars in Sudan, which have cost, again, hundreds of thousands of lives since the 1980s. And we are almost entirely ignorant of what is going on there. Or Myanmar, do we really understand what's going on in the conflicts going on in Myanmar at the moment? And that's why I say that we live in a kind of bubble, it seems to me, here, since the end of the Second World War. But if we actually care to look out over the parapet, the war is going on somewhere all the time, and often wars, savage wars with extraordinarily high levels of casualty.
You've mentioned in the book and in this conversation about our knowledge of history. And I was wondering about, war is often glorified on film. We're speaking the day after the 80th anniversary of D-Day,
Mm,
and Saving Private Ryan
mm,
is always mentioned. That chooses sort of reality, the opening
mm,
scene. But do you think that's something that is problematic? Because particularly in the wake of the Second World War, we had so many
mm,
films that
mm,
would show a positive side of it, and it's the best way for young people to access history
mm,
through film.
mm, mm.
Um, do you see a problem there, or is that overblown?
No, I've used the problem. It's not just there. It's of course it's a problem in whether it's video games or it's films about goodies killing baddies. The whole content is war oriented. You got one group or gangs on against another group or gang, or a larger community against another larger community, so that you never get away from the idea that conflict and killing. Look at the number of film publicity posters which have got a picture of a man or a woman holding a big gun, and it happens all the time. And I just wish it didn't happen. I wish that the film industry focused a little bit more on more sensitive subjects. But it's all around us. So, although, as I said just now, we look over the parapet at the wars that are going on elsewhere and we don't pay much attention to them. In fact, it can be on your cinema screen, or in your Netflix box, every day of the week. Um, yes, I wish the film and video industry thought differently about it, but they're not going to. It sells.
Yeah, I think that one of the most interesting areas of this, not to dwell too long on it, but in the wake of the Vietnam War, there was a lot of introspection in America about how it had behaved,
Mm,
and particularly with its treatment of soldiers and obviously civilians in Vietnam. But that soon was forgotten, and
mm.
now we're back to depicting. Do you think then that defeat in war is something that it can be a healthy thing? I mean, we talk about
Mm,
Germany. Germany's a
mm,
power in Europe now, and it
mm.
lost humility. It was destroyed.
Well, I can produce films and literature which are more sensitive to the issues. Well, one thinks after the First World War, remarks all quiet on the Western Front, which anybody reading that ought to have thought to themselves, let's not do it again. So, yeah, defeating war produces a kind of introspection and a greater sensitivity, I think, to what war represents. And the Vietnam example you use, I think, is a good one because there was a good deal of reflection in America about what that war had actually meant. But we are back really into the heroes and villains, the black and white view of conflict, and we do need much greater sensibility really about what war really represents.
And in Britain, do you think then that we look at the past, the Second World War, in the right way? I was asked recently about young people not being aware what D-Day was.
Mm,
And my view was that, we shouldn't get too worried about that knowledge because that will come in time.
mm,
As you get older, you learn more about history. Young people, we shouldn't sort of hit them over the head too much. They've gone through
mm,
COVID and things like that. But in Britain, where do you think our view is of war? Do you think we glorify it too much?
Well, I mean, it's a very important part of the British narrative. There was this, problem after 1945 of Britain in decline and so on, loses the empire and so on. Where is it going? And sustaining that heroic war narrative has been a very important part of public culture, historical culture in Britain, and it still is a very important part. I think it will change, of course, because of the last 20 years, all these celebrations and commemorations and so on have involved veterans. Veterans will die out in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, and we'll have to start thinking about the war perhaps rather differently. It's not the experience of one's parents or even grandparents anymore. It's a distant experience. And yeah, maybe Britain will move on. Maybe too, there'll be greater acknowledgement of some of the things in British history in the 1930s and 1940s, or 50s, we should not be quite so proud of.
That's an interesting way to end it, Richard. This has been very interesting. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Plenty more great episodes to come. And if you can give a kind rating on Apple or Spotify, I'd be hugely grateful. But until then, thank you and good night.